really got an incredible group of folks here. I'm just here to cat herd the best I can, but these are some of the smartest cats in the business. So this should be good stuff, and it certainly will expand on what Jason talked about and what I talked about earlier. So I'm just going to allow them to introduce myself and start with Ron to my left here.
Good morning. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for being here. What do I do? I've been a consultant CTO for a while. Prior to that, I was with Equinix, working for the CTO office, and prior to that with AT&T, where I ran most of the cloud programs, and before that with Deloitte Consulting, and before that in enterprise IT. So I wear many hats. I'm an enterprise guy who has come into the service provider business, and I've been a consumer of data center services all my life because I used to work very closely in database and infrastructure. So it was always expecting the best out of data center. And I just started a new job at ServiceNow as an executive architect, where I'll be advising CIOs on cloud transformations and IT asset management. Okay.
I'm Jason Waxman, so I run the Cloud Solutions Group at Intel. I've been with Intel for 20 years and always focused on the evolution of data center technology.
My name is Brian Green. I'm a global lead data center engineering operations for Visa. I've been in the data center business about 10 years. Prior to that, I used to work for JP Morgan desktop support, and a long, long time ago, I used to drive ships for a living, the ultimate enterprise data center.
Nice. Nice. All right. So I'm going to do my best to leave a little bit of time for questions. Hopefully, you guys will be more awake by the end of the thing, and you can actually ask us some questions and test us. But I want to start with a question that was pretty much part of what I kicked off with, and ask each of you for your thoughts on what does it mean when we say the death of the enterprise data center. Ron?
So death has a few definitions. Death does not mean always dying, in my opinion. Death sometimes means a long tail. Death can also mean a steady state, but not dead. As I've been consulting and talking to enterprises who are going through their cloud transformation, what I'm seeing is that the question the CFO asks is very different than the questions the CIO asks. And inevitably, it is related to money. And you can't go to the business with a cool whiz-bang and say that this is the coolest and the latest. Ultimately, it comes down to numbers, that what part of SG&A is going to be. Is it predictable? Is it not? I serve on several technology committees, one of them with Oracle, and what we found is that Oracle customers have a lot of ERP, and they're like, well, it's working 7 days a week, 70 to 80% of the time, the resources of the servers and disk farms are pegged out. Why would we go to cloud? And so the answer is mixed. What I'm finding is that new services such as microservices and containers and serverless computing, those whiz-bang new apps which need machine learning and all, they tend to gravitate towards new public cloud architectures. But there are a lot of companies, if you track HP, Dell, the companies that are selling to the enterprise data centers, they're still in business. Yes, they have recorrected themselves and all of that, but they're not dead. So by that definition, the enterprise data center is not dead, but it has to be on its toes.
Right, right.
That's how I see it.
I think like a lot of things, there's a pendulum that swings. Just like everything in life, there's the extremes. Yeah. And I remember somebody telling me that a year ago, if you pulled out any airline magazine, it basically said you're an idiot if you're running your own data center. Everything's going to move to the public cloud. And now what I see is that pretty much every CIO that we talk to has a strategy of these are the things that will go, these are the things that are going to stay on-prem. It's about balance, and it is about that steady state. And I think we are seeing that change occur, and I think it's also fundamentally driven to some degree by technology. There was for a while, ability to deliver a cloud on-prem. There was no ability to get that same type of efficiency or agility or to easily deploy containers. It was really to the narrow few, the super technologically advanced. And so I think as we see that democratization of technology, we see efficient data centers being deployed, it becomes an economic decision. It becomes a matter of what data really needs to reside within the walls of the company or the location of the facility, et cetera. And those decisions, I think, are being made every day. But I do think the steady state is balanced.
Let's see, so I get to go at the end. So as we look at the statement that the enterprise is dead, I think, or the enterprise data center is dead, if you were sitting on stage maybe 10 years ago, they would have said mainframe is dead. Yet we're still here with mainframes. And I think ultimately it's driven by business strategy and the value provided by what you want to keep in-house versus what you want to take outside. And ultimately, it goes back to some of the things that Mark was saying earlier. What are those core functions that you get out of your data center? The physical security, the control of the data, and stuff keeping close. And I think we're just, back to what Jason was just saying. It's a pendulum, and it's evolving. But, as data center operators and owners, we constantly have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what value are we providing for the things that we do?
So good, great answer. And, from my perspective, all of those answers are correct, and there are other answers that will drive your business decisions, like I talked about earlier. But I think the key, maybe the single key point from my perspective, is that don't get married to the idea that you have to own or build any particular thing for your enterprise. Get married to the idea that you have to be able to support the services required for the business to be successful. And if that is supported more effectively by building or managing your own data center, that's great. But if it's not, then you shouldn't try to make it fit, right? There must be an assumption that current trends in the tech space will have an impact on data center design. And Jason, you talked about that. I want to start with you because you talked about that a little bit in your presentation, and then we'll work our way out. Give us some thoughts on how maybe some of the trends, or certainly some of the technologies that are going into the data center today, and maybe not just Intel's technologies,
Sure.
How they might affect data center design.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things I would say, which is a fundamental trend, is going back to just larger compute, making the most of what you have. The amount of power that's being delivered, and I see massive amounts of data center. And I won't name the customer, but I remember talking to one massive data center leader, and the way that they provision their infrastructure is they build for a certain amount of power and they build out that power, and that's what they've got, and how do they make the most of it. And I think that certainly is an interesting way to start that design. But it does say that as we move to a world of artificial intelligence and more compute-intensive analytics apps, it really is going to be continually more challenging. So I think that, to me, is one of the fundamental changes, is how do you think about really what flexibility in your data center looks like, and how does that start with how you lay out the infrastructure, the power, the cooling, to drive for that type of massive compute. And I'd say the other thing, too, is the complexity of the network. And I do fundamentally believe that one of the big changes here is that if you're never going to have scale, then you might be better off being in somebody else's data center. Not to say that you won't have certain things to go store or do this, but strategically. But if you do have scale, the network is going to become increasingly more complex. Copper isn't going to scale forever. The distances that you have to drive, looking at optics as the approach and what that's going to go mean, and also how many layers within the network architecture and the topology. So those are some of the things that I think are going to become those fundamental changes. And I think the more successful leaders that I see are building around fewer nodes, more aggregated, more flexibility, and that means everything, not just compute, network, and storage, but also the power and the facility itself.
So Brian, speaking for Visa at a minimum, but just from general experience, how do you see the trends affecting what you do?
Just in general, one of the things that we see, a lot of the efficiencies and innovation being driven out of the hyperscale markets, because they're such large builds, such large frequent builds. In the enterprise space, we build less frequently, and it's at a point in time. So if you look at a site that was built 10 years ago, a lot of the stuff that Jason just talked about, the evolution of the network, the power densities is different than it was 10 years ago, yet we're forced to compete on the same level. And I think ultimately, going back to what he was saying about the flexibility, you don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years, but you have to be able to have enough flexibility with your environment to build, maximize the power that you have, and also as you build out, you have to have the anticipation for growth. So it's always matching what the demand is, but you have to have a good flexible capital plan and build plan to grow on site, and that allows you the flexibility to deal with the optionality of what's going to happen with technology.
Ron?
I echo exactly what Brian and Jason, you said. My view is also that to some degree, the choice cannot be made from the infrastructure level going up, and that is largely to the point you alluded about machine learning, analytics, power-hungry CPUs. So what happens in a typical enterprise is that enterprises will have some applications which are homegrown, but then there's a mix of applications they buy from SAP, Google, AWS, Oracle, name it, 6 to 10 top companies. Now, the issue is this, that these companies are all becoming cloud providers, have already become cloud providers. AWS was the first cloud provider, Azure has, and Oracle's headed there, and Google's headed there. So the innovations are happening at a pace. So the hyperscale aspect is innovation at infrastructure, but the innovations at the application tier, how to use machine learning, how to take pieces of it, put it on the edge, those innovations cannot be done by enterprise IT the way they are being done by the cloud service providers. So for an enterprise IT shop, whether you are too attached to a data center or not, a CIO has to look at his or her team with the aspect that, how do I provide the best service to that? And in that case, the only choice may be public cloud. And the other aspect is that companies which were on-prem are going to the public cloud. They're doing everything to not incentivize their sales force to sell on-prem licenses or the ones that have been sold. So there is a risk there. I mean, it's a counterbalance. Yes, you have steady state workloads, things that won't change. That would be the mainframe. So maybe the enterprise data center is the mainframe of yesterday. That is one aspect of it. But the modernization of applications and the modernization of technologies, which we just talked about, that is definitely happening. And the security, I mean, the amount of people, I think AWS has about 850 machine learning engineers. That was about 750 to 60 about 2 years ago. And that is the same story they go to CMU and other universities and go to put everybody in a bus and hire them by the dozens. So you can't compete with that. And that fundamentally changes the equation in a massive way.
Yeah. So what we've heard, I mean, and I want to pick up on something that Brian said as well. A lot of us don't think about that when we're thinking about our private data centers, and that's that the networking is enormous. Not only the networking in the building itself, but the network access to the rest of the world. And so many companies that I talk to, even some co-location providers, have only 3 to 5 providers, and many private companies have 1 to 3 providers. And the basic problem with having 1 to 3 providers is that you, in effect, are saying you have no ability to make those guys compete with each other. Because if you get rid of one, that means you don't have any competition anymore. So they both know that you can't get rid of the other one, in which case they both are going to charge you more than they probably should, right? So on top of that, you don't necessarily know that you have shortest path or best route to get to low latency services. You don't have the most flexibility to get to other locations if you only have a couple of providers. So when you think about your flexibility and you think about whether or not you can provide power density, well, yeah, okay, maybe I will need 25 kW per cabinet in the next 3 to 5 years. But if I'm going to build for that kind of capacity, do I put it all in place and have it sit there going fallow until I find an app that needs 25 kW? Or do I design in a way that allows me to add the power as I go? Or do I have an already set demand for some racks at 25 kW that I can start with, right? So again, trying to go back to the point I made in the slide about the basic premise is that this is easy. This is not easy. And the average data center that was built more than 3 or 4 years ago, even in co-location, let alone in enterprise, is already dead from my perspective of what a working data center is. Because the raised floors won't handle the weights that are coming for storage. They won't handle the power densities that are required. They likely don't have access to the network that's needed. So, and most of them are not designed in a way that allow you to do uninterrupted replacement of equipment in order to enable better capability in that same facility without interrupting services. So those are all real issues. And if you can't help answer those issues for your enterprise, then now is the best time to start thinking about it. I talked a little bit about ownership. I want to start with you this time, Ron. When you think about ownership and you think about data center capacity, does it have to necessarily mean ownership because you own the physical building, or should ownership be raised up a level to the point of almost being a strategy relative to getting the compute or the resource that you need, where you need it, when you need it?
I defer towards the latter, because one of the fundamental changes happening in the business is that CIOs and their organizations are being asked to become trusted advisors of the business, and that was always the case. But the point is that this time you're not being measured by what kind of a data center you build, but what kind of service you provided reliably. So one of the fundamental changes happening in IT over a lot of companies is that you used to have storage architects, you used to have network architects, you used to have server architects. Some of them specialize in Unix, some of them specialize in Windows, and name it depending on the size of the company. I've been in companies where people used to just have a NetApp architect and an EMC architect, and then sometimes a Windows architect. Those roles are being replaced by what is called cloud architect. And the cloud architect is a person who is part operator, part advisor, part strategist. And most CIOs are asking their companies to go get AWS certified or Azure certified, and that person is the person that is shaping the thing. If you're a cloud architect working for a provider, that's a different thing. But let's talk about the one who is working for the internal IT. And that is what the idea is, that you should be able to do a balance sheet on math on this side and the technology on this side. And we want people who can do both. We don't want somebody who's just doing this. And that feeds into what you said, Mark.
Right. I'm going to skip Jason. How about you, Brian? What's your thought on that?
And ultimately, it's about accountability. So, for me and my team, it's all about everything associated with data centers. It means that we understand it's not just about providing the connectivity. It's not just about providing the always reliable service. It really comes down to being able to see around corners, the proverbial canary in a coal mine. Anybody that has operated an enterprise data center knows you go through the approval cycle for finance, and you have the execution. And if you haven't anticipated what's going to happen 18 to 24 months ahead, much less 3 to 5 years, you're already dead in the water. And the days of just looking down, hey, I just keep things up, it just doesn't work anymore. And you have to think about the financial implications. What's the business strategy? Where are you going to see growth and have very close relationships with your product partners, your application development partners, because ultimately we exist to provide a service. And if the service is better somewhere else, you are truly dead. So.
Yeah. Jason, you want to add anything to that?
Just real quick, I very much agree. I think accountability, and I just sort of add, decision making. Do you feel like you have control over the decisions that you need to make? So one of the things that we did here actually on Wall Street is we formed an enterprise cloud computing council from some of the member banks that were very concerned about, even when they didn't have a facility, what were the SLAs that they were going to go get from cloud service providers. So for example, do you get to decide when they're going to go migrate or shut down or do a patch? And those are real things for you to go do. So it really doesn't matter whether it's the facility, but are you really in charge? Are you accountable, but you're also in charge of all the decisions around security, uptime, SLAs, et cetera.
Right.
Because your CIO will be calling you.
Yes.
Yeah. So you guys probably can tell where I stand on this. I see data center capacity as not a particular piece or technology, but rather the service that data center can provide, and that could be cloud, it could be colocation, or it could be your own private spot, or it could be an edge closet if that's appropriate. So, resilience and reliability, and of course, we're at an event that's sponsored by and driven by Uptime along with DCD, and so resiliency has meaning to a lot of us, but as does reliability and redundancy. I want to start with Brian this time. When you think about any one of those three words, what do you think the trend from an industry standpoint is to applying, the word you pick to what you do and its importance today?
I think it really comes down to ubiquitous availability in the enterprise data center space. We're in the in case stuff happens business. I'll keep it clean, keep my sailor to myself. I do think anything can happen. In one of our enterprise sites, we've experienced earthquakes. We got struck by lightning that was and things like that completely took down our cooling plant, yet we stayed up. And I think, going back to what you were saying earlier about accountability, resiliency, redundancy, if you can think it, it can happen. And if you can't think, if you didn't think that might happen, you might be stuck in it anyway. So, as we look at design day planning, what could go wrong? What is the worst possible thing? Not to be pessimistic, but I think to be successful, sometimes, you have to be pessimistic, because if you can think it, it could probably happen.
So I want to change up the question a little bit, and still on the same theme, Jason. But so if you think about what Brian just said and the original question, and think about, we're talking about the enterprise data center, right? So if you're running the data center, or the ability to provide applications to your business, you're providing that responsibility for your company. What would you try to do to provide the kind of resilience without trying to spend what a hyperscaler would spend at their scale to provide resilience? What would you try to do for the enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, I think just maybe in its simplest terms, one is software versus hardware. When I think, by the way, I like resilience versus redundancy. Redundancy by its nature, just and moving to any time where you're fully redundant, unless it's something that's super mission critical. Moving to an N+1 type of configuration, I think in general is a much more cost-effective way to be able to go. So maybe simple terms.
So just to expand on that a little bit, and would you suggest then that if I'm let's say I've got a data center and I've got space, and I decide to put my apps in there, and the data center is built to some equivalent of a tier 3 or something, and we're running it as well as Brian runs his data centers. But really, the ability to provide not only general access to this application, but the kind of resiliency and reliability that's required means that I either have to up-tier the data center or build another data center. What is the best option under that kind of model?
Or I guess I'm also a fan of a hybrid cloud type of model, a partnership. Right. I mean, one of the benefits that operating in a cloud does definitely have, and you pay for this, right? I mean, it's not necessarily, moving to a public cloud is not necessarily cheaper, but one of the real strong benefits that you get is you get, multiple failure zones. I mean, they have the ability to build all those things. I don't recommend necessarily that everybody's building out their own data centers, but having some sort of, again, N+1 type of solution.
And so, to you, Ron, I mean, there's actually kind of two questions I'd like to ask. Maybe I'll save one of them for myself. So I'll stick with the idea of, if I'm attempting to leverage resources the best way I can, and I have an application that I can't service with my existing data center, how should the IT owner look at that responsibility in providing the appropriate level of availability and reliability and latency sensitivity and all that stuff? What should they try to do? I mean, is it a partner thing? Is it a go your own route type of thing? How do you see that?
So I think it's a mix of many things, but ultimately it's a mix of hybrid type of an architecture and architecting for success. So what I mean by that is that if I'm a CIO and I'm asking my team, or the business is asking the CIO who asks his or her team that this is what I want, and the data center cannot do it today, then I have to have 3 or 4 options. Those options could be either something on-prem and something on public cloud, and then the networking in between. The networking changes dramatically, so you have to figure out how are you going to connect all the users to different networks, and then what the data sets are going to be between or you could have your own data center, a colo, and a public cloud, all 3. Or you could have the hybrid configuration would be your data center and then 3 other public clouds and no colo.
Right.
So it depends on a case-by-case basis, but the idea was to map out the technology solutions and put a realistic cost estimate right next to it, with some degree of comfort to the CFO who would know that, well, you're going to be in this 10 to 20% ballpark. Don't say 2 million per month and now it went to 10 million per month.
Right.
2 million going to 2.2, it may be acceptable, but not 4 million.
Right.
So there's some of the predictive modeling has to be done in terms of workloads, storage, spikes, network traffic, and most of the cloud providers, they have estimators to do that. So I would recommend that use those tools effectively, use your own knowledge, and then try to minimize the number of touch points between the different owners.
So I mean, a basic theme then from pretty much all 3 of you is that we shouldn't assume that we have to do this all on our own, right? Even if you've decided that owning data centers is the appropriate thing for your business, you definitely need partners in almost every major action you're doing relative to things like global resiliency or reliability for applications or geo-distribution. So take advantage of the partners that you know.
Actually, just one thing that I've seen as another interesting change on that point is, again, going back a couple of years ago, everything had to be agnostic, multi-vendor, level playing field. The world of complexity that we've lived in, I've seen a posture change in many CIOs, which is, I don't care how many vendors you've got, I don't care how many, just get it done and make sure it's being done reliability. There's so much complexity here. And so I do see very much a partnership model where companies are bringing in those partners as strategic partners, not just one of 15 different vendors.
Right. Exactly. And the only other thing, and sorry, Brian, why don't you go ahead?
No, I said, no, it's always strategic and well thought out at who you want to partner up with to provide that resilience. And one other point I was going to make is always understand what the true cost of failure is, because at the core of any business case, it's like, well, if this happens, the probability, this is the cost. Is it brand damaging? Is it we lose revenue flows, lose partners, as opposed to what it costs to pay for the resilience via a partner or in your infrastructure or in your application resiliency. But always know what that cost of failure is, because that's the language that, as the IT enterprise guy, I have to live, because ultimately I serve a business.
Right. So I'm just going to add two things really quickly. One is that for those of you who don't know this, IT organizations suck at risk identification and measurement, right? This is how I did risk measurement when I was doing it. It's like, okay, I know some stuff, and I think some stuff, and yeah, it's going to be this much damage to the enterprise if this goes bad. There's no testing, there's no validation. Never once have I done even $100 million project and had somebody come back to me afterwards and say, Mark, did you hit the ROI numbers after year one? Not once. So, being responsible to your business means considering things like that. And one of the partners you can get is somebody that can actually help to measure that risk effectively for you. Another one is that, and this is the part that most of the time people roll their eyes at, because nobody wants to talk about organization stuff. They want to talk about the biggest power unit and the biggest server and all that stuff. But in the end, when my slide about looking at the mirror, if you can't look at the mirror and say, I've got the right team, or I've got the right enterprise support from my management team to build and manage the right team to do the things that I want to own for the company, then that's got to be your first stepping stone to deciding whether to keep, buy, borrow, or do some combination of the above. Because, you look at a company like Google or Microsoft or Facebook, or I'm sure even Visa, they don't have one person that does power acquisition. They don't have one person. They've got, some of these companies have got company-size organizations just to acquire the property or just to acquire the power, right? They've taken ownership of running a data center very seriously because it is their bread and butter. And in my mind, in order to provide that data center capacity and service to your business effectively, you have to at least think about it that way, even if you use partners to get you part of the way. So, this has always been a tough one for me, and I've had to do this a couple of times. And I'll start with you again, Brian, and work my way back. If you're to look at an existing data center, or even if you need more capacity, and maybe your company has a building, or you have access to a building that happens to be nearby, how do you go about the process of determining, whether to retrofit an existing facility or build brand new?
I think a lot of it has to do, when I talk about forecasting, what the actual demand is. One of the things that is most important is measure everything. And when I say measure everything, measure what the power draw is on an individual day. Make sure you understand how many of the actual individual servers or storage was installed or decamped at the same day. And you have to do trending over that over a long period of time, because it goes back to what I said about predicting how much the demand is. One of the things looking at, industry trends, power densities are increasing 6%, or power growth is 6% per year, and then using that to project. Also, as you look in a build versus a retrofit versus an outsource, it's understanding what that time to market is and what the underlying dynamics are. Well, I can add additional megawatt over the course of, a year by adding additional UPS units. I have to do that in a live environment versus there's a whole wide scale change in the type of service that we provide. We want to go to a hyperscale or a larger environment. I need the white space. And I think a lot of this goes back to this concept of data center grooming. The most important thing that any data center provider provides, particularly an enterprise data center, is that 2 by 2 by 2 square where you have the compute. It's ultimately the factory by which we provide our services. And understanding how you can grow that within a certain time frame to support the business is extremely important, but ultimately it's anticipating the growth. Growth is a factor. If the business is not there, then it doesn't make sense to build new. Maybe it's an incremental scale, and then you track and measure how that happens over a period of time. And then you have to build trust with your executive partners by your accuracy and forecast, and that's what helps determine when it makes sense to grow, step function wise or just incrementally.
Right. Jason, any thoughts?
Two other factors that I might layer on top. One is scale, and the other is the application requirement. So, largely depends on what you're actually running, right? Goes back to the service and what's the most efficient way. So you look at kind of the cost of delivering that service and what does that infrastructure essentially require, and is that something then you could put into that infrastructure or not? And then the second is scale. Obviously if you're not going to be building a lot of scale, a lot of, greenfield is very expensive. If you're building at scale, concrete's cheap. And if you look at most hyperscale data centers, it's just, you just keep adding on the building block. What's really more important is, are you building out that new service in the most efficient way possible? So, two vectors at least to sort of see as helping with that.
The clients I've been advising and talking to, it's been a mixed bag because they typically start with, well, this is where today, and CFOs go to meetings where they hear that infrastructure is not needed anymore, And they come back to the CIO and say, we hear the infrastructure is not needed anymore. And there's this thing called serverless computing, and that thing still runs on servers. You're still making function calls, but you're paying somebody else by the dip for it. So what I'm seeing in transformation is people are going through cloud is that they start with a slate and they start to do this mapping of what remains, what goes. Often they miss a cost element or two, which kind of shocks them. And it could be that, okay, we're going to go this, new expansion will happen in the public cloud, and then we'll have X workload that goes there, Y goes there, Z goes there. Often they forget the networking piece. So then they realize that, wait a minute, the entire cost savings of what we thought is not there. So often they go back to the drawing board repetitively, and it takes them usually a few iterations before the case is usually settled. So the clients I've been advising, the role I've been in more recently has been more going towards the cloud. And I've been helping clients solve these equations. And so that's what I've been seeing, Mark.
Yeah,
it's a mixed.
It is, and so I agree with pretty much everything that's been said here, and we could get into a lot of the weeds around, there might be a brown site or another building that was being used before. Well, can you provide the same kind of security that you should really provide at that new facility or that new building? Right. Can you provide the power redundancy or the power separation from other power required in that particular facility? Is the foundation built to X pounds per square inch? Well, you have to redo that. So are there materials in the building that aren't as corporate sustainability friendly? The list goes on and on. Can you provide the kind of pressure in that facility, pressure management to manage against air loss and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So these are all real questions. And so as was pointed out and hinted at a couple of times, sometimes the easy jump is not the right jump. So if you're going to make a decision, you think it through very carefully. So,
so the variability. So a lot of CIOs I find are trying to apply cloud-like principles to their data centers wherever they can. And what that really means is, as you said in your first session in the morning, not building for the end state, but building for states intermediate. So power consumption is an example for that. If you're pulling so many kilowatts, you pay for that. You're not paying for X amount of power. So if you go to a colo, it is possible that you might be having a power contract. If you're running your own enterprise, you could negotiate the power contracts with your utility So basically make it variable.
Right.
So the amount of variability you can introduce for the infrastructure,
Yeah.
for the power, and all the cost levers is a defining success in that, towards that metric.
Totally agree. Yep. All right. So last question. And this time I'm going to start with you and work your way back. How do you think, and I realize that's not probably part of your day job now, but how does energy efficiency play into decisions around your company's choices, or how should it?
Well, it is definitely not part of my day job, but with the clients I've been talking to, I guess what I've seen is the energy efficiency is not it's not a CIO, it's not a CFO question for sure. The CFO question is more of the dollars and cents that comes down to it. The question that comes down to is I'm planning the facilities for a data center, and I have equipment that needs to be modernized, whether it is I'm rearranging the cooling patterns because of a new or I'm doing liquid cooling, or I'm doing rearranging the racks or putting a more power-hungry CPUs there, when I'm rearranging the furniture, so to speak. It really comes down to the fact that what am I spending for the buck? I mean, what am I gaining by making it more efficient?
Yeah.
So in general, nobody says no to high energy efficiency. Everybody likes the fact that you can get more with less.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give sort of the same question to Brian, but before we get to Brian, Jason, I'm going to ask you the question in a different way. Mm-hmm. When you think about energy efficiency, there's 1,000 ways to look at the problem that is the data center space, from how thick the walls are, to what color the roof is, to whether you seal the doors, to whether you push the air from below or drop it from above, to whether you can regulate the amount of air in which part of the room, whether you're in a higher humidity area or lower, et cetera, right? But the things that most of us that worry about the pure data center don't talk about all the time, and it was hinted at a little bit yesterday, are things like application performance efficiency, in the sense that applications are actually designed to run more efficiently, so they use less CPU and memory to operate. But specifically thinking about it from the Intel perspective, what have you seen in the way of either bad habits or good habits in thinking through how you buy, how you use your compute to get most energy efficiency?
Yeah. So I think first, having a clear picture of what you're measuring. If you measure the right way, then it drives the right behavior. We've always looked at performance divided by TCO as the model. And for hyperscalers, as an example, about half of TCO is the cost of the equipment, and then about another quarter is related to power, and another quarter is like everything kind of else in there. And so we always encourage people to model and say, okay, if you make this change, what does it do to performance? What does it do to the cost of the systems that you're putting in and the cost of power? And I think taking that holistic look, what I worry about with power efficiency, and I think we're largely out of this phase, but we went through, a pretty bad period where power efficiency meant low power. And here's what happened. This is the bad behavior. Low power meant well, great, I'll have a low power node, and therefore I need more of those nodes. Well, guess what? Net effect was, instead of driving over that equation where I got more performance per dollar spent, I actually went in the wrong direction. And that's why I was an advocate earlier of, I do think the world is moving for the applications toward a more performant node, and to go drive that performant fewer nodes, which then if you do the modeling, again, mileage may vary, but I think it nets a better outcome.
So I mean, for the layman like me, if I could interpret what you said, it's possible that even though normally I'd like to keep my hardware for 3 or 4 years, that in order to actually get the most efficiency and the best performance at the right cost, it might actually make sense for me to rotate my hardware sooner rather than later.
Definitely, and I think we see, again, depends on the application, sometimes 3 years or less sometimes to rotate things out. It just depends on the efficiency of the equipment, sure.
And that wasn't a leading question for the guy that happens to work for a company that sells chips. That I've actually done that. I mean, it's actually a real thing, where you can get better compute for less cost because power is such a huge driver. And if you can get twice as much performance and use less energy, then for that same performance, then it can actually pay for the hardware sooner than you think. So, Brian, take your pick. How'd you like to go off of this questioning?
I think it ties. I think when I think of efficiency, I think it ties back to what you were saying earlier about accountability. ultimately, our team owns the budget for running this enterprise site. So to the extent that we're able to be more efficient and drive down our cost, I mean, that's really where our value is added. So if we look at our power trends of your IT load increasing at a rate of, let's say, 6%, but your overall power load is increasing at 2 to 3%, that spread is the value that you bring, and those are real dollars. And ultimately, how you achieve that understanding, whether it be, with LED lighting, raising the temperatures, your inlet temperatures on your cooling side of your infrastructure, it's understanding what levers you're pulling to drive that cost down. It's full transparency in the environment. One of the interesting things about being in the data center, there's a gazillions, if that's a real word, of different things to measure. And as you measure everything, it's drawing those individual streams to paint the overall picture. And efficiency is just one of those very important factors, because that's a real dollars and cents thing. You can go back to your executive management.
Right. So folks, before we wrap up, any questions from the audience? We got one in the back.
As you guys are looking at potentially the death of the enterprise data center, and you talk about measuring and being responsible to your enterprise, at what point are you guys doing chargeback or talking about basically showing back to the organization what your value is on the enterprise side? And I guess this is mostly for Brian.
Okay. I'll do a tap dance. No, I think it's full transparency. It's understanding at a certain point of the day, application X is using this much power, and then on the back end, that application is generating this much revenue. That's the Valhalla of our industry. And all the different ways that you metric that is full transparent, how your enterprise is doing. What is the true value add of that, let's say, of an application that has everything else supporting it, the product, the marketing associated with it, as well as the underlying infrastructure. So each application ultimately has a P&L that you track back to everything, and maybe that'll happen in my lifetime, but that's the Valhalla, I think, where we have to get to. Because then it's a very apples to apples conversation.
Cool. Henry?
Yeah, I was wondering whether or not either security and or the advent of GDPR is going to change your perspective on how the data center has to scale and progress.
Yeah, I would love to take a stab at that, and then maybe we can get at least one other person to talk to. We've been given the virtual yank, so we can't stay too long. But I would say that both of those questions fall into the category of using both application capability and partners more effectively, right? So from a data protection standpoint, whether it's traditional rules about sharing data across borders or GDPR and or security, one of the things that we've largely done ineffectively in enterprise applications, in cloud management and container management, et cetera, is provide the kind of AI or policy-driven workload management that allows to ensure that workload and or their data access only execute where they're supposed to, right? And I think that's, unfortunately today, even some of the biggest companies are having to do a lot of that work manually still. And in some cases having to invest in places where they otherwise wouldn't. And I think for the industry, and I've talked to some of those very people, I won't give their names right now, but I've talked to some of those very people at the highest levels of companies that should be working on that, and they're behind, right? I mean, and everybody loves Kubernetes today as an example, but Kubernetes doesn't even scratch the surface for being able to help with that yet, nor do most of the tools that run around Kubernetes. So, sorry I can't give you a better answer. Anybody else want to touch on that at all, or?
I agree. It's a work in progress for the industry. I mean, there are so many different things at the data center level, and I'd interpret it two different ways. One, I agree with you. There's the data locality and ensuring who has access, et cetera. But there's also just the whole trust of the infrastructure itself. I think that's another piece. Whether it's physical or logical, everything. We have some companies that want trusted supply chains now. We want to make sure every piece of firmware in the platform, I mean, it's becoming a giant
Using blockchain?
discussion.
It's all blockchain. Blockchain is the answer.
Yeah.
I'm going to go get some
Yeah, there you
blockchain
go.
for lunch. It's all blockchain. All right. So thank you very much, folks, and thanks to the panel.
Yeah, thanks.